Hello and welcome to our next installment of the Right to Clean Water Casting podcast. This is Melissa Martin with the Florida Right to Clean Water Initiative. And with me today is my special guest, friend and mentor, hero. I could go on,
We got to
but
start over.
we're going to hear from Laurilee Thompson about her insights on the issues affecting her world, the Indian River Lagoon, multiple industries, and how it's affected or could be affected in a very positive way by this amendment initiative. So, Laurilee, you're a lifelong resident of Brevard County, co-owner of the Dixie Crossroads seafood restaurant, well-known advocate for so many things, national and state fisheries, the lagoon, natural systems, pretty much all the above, like the world. Um, thank you for all of your life, really, your life service to so many things. Um, Before we get started, I just wanted to introduce the audience to who you are, where you came from, and one of those things is the fact that you come from a family, a fifth, you're a fifth generation Floridian. Is that correct?
Yeah, actually, well, I wasn't born in Florida. I was born while my dad was in the service. He was in the Air Force during the Korean War. So I was
Mhm.
actually born in Montana, but I'm like the only person in my family for generations that wasn't born in Florida. And if I would have had my wish, I would have wanted to be born in Florida. And my parents came home when I was 6 weeks old. So I call myself a fifth generation Floridian. I've been in Florida since I was 6 weeks old, and
I
that's
think that
a very
counts.
long time.
I think that definitely counts. So what year was that when the first folks from your
Well, the first people that came here, the first one was my great great grandfather Lewis Thursby, who settled at Blue Spring State Park. So if you go to Blue Spring State Park and you see that beautiful old cracker home that sits on top of the Indian Mound, my great great grandfather built that house, planted the first orange groves in Orange City, and um, let's see, my other great great grandfather came down with Henry Flagler when Flagler was building the Florida East Coast Railroad. Mr. Flagler established a railroad camp in Titusville, and my great great grandfather liked it and brought the rest of the family down, and so there we go. And then I've got relatives all over the state, with similar types of stories.
good Lord, Miss Florida. Oh, that's what your
Oh
name
no,
is.
there's people that have been here longer than my family.
To me, you are Miss Florida. That's pretty cool. So your childhood, since you were 6 weeks old at least, um, is really on or in the waters or around along the shorelines of Florida waters. Can you share with us how it was to grow up in Florida during your childhood?
It was magical. It, and I was lucky. I had a good place to grow up because my father built boats and operated a little boat selling operation, which was right next to my grandfather's fishing pier.
Mhm.
So when they built the old wooden bridge, the first wooden bridge across the northern Indian River Lagoon was here at Titusville, and it was called the Walker Bridge. Well, in the late 1940s, they built a cement bridge that had a swinging gate on it for boats to go through. That an operator could operate, didn't have to walk out to the middle of the bridge and wind a crank around. So they were tearing down the old wooden bridge, and my grandfather had this idea that the bridge could be a really good fishing pier and it would be really wasteful to tear it down. So he went to the city council and they decided, yeah, that was a good idea. So they approached the Army Corps of Engineers and asked them to leave the western span of the bridge in place. And they did. And my grandfather built a bait house out on the pier. And my dad, he had a dredge and a pile driver, and he expanded and extended the pier. Actually, it came all the way to our house, so we could go all the way out to my granddad's bait house without going out on the highway, which we weren't allowed to do. Um, and so I grew up on that fishing pier. By the time I was 10 years old, I was working for a living. My dad would take me up to Haulover Canal and drop me in a little boat off, and I'd spend the day pushing a push net through the seagrass beds to catch shrimp for my grandfather to sell at his pier. And from there, I started trapping pigfish. Then I had blue crab traps. I worked my way on the river through junior high school and college. Graduated with it to a gill net. That was the last thing I did on the river. I went to school down in Jensen Beach. It was fabulous. The college was right on the shore of the Indian River Lagoon. I pulled my boat right up on the shore behind the classrooms, continued to fish at night there. And then when I got out of college, I got a job on the back deck of a swordfish boat and worked my way up to running commercial fishing boats out in the ocean. I spent 10 years out on the ocean. And that was during the 1980s. So when I left the Indian River, it was in pretty good shape. Still there was a lot of development going on, a lot of new causeways being built, a lot of new people moving to the county. Titusville had exploded during the space age, the Apollo era, and we had thousands of new people move to town. But the river still wasn't showing the signs of neglect at that point. But when I got back after spending 10 years out on the ocean, and now it's the end of the 1980s, I was appalled. I couldn't believe what the river looked like. Now, at that point in time, the municipalities were still dumping sewage into the river. Right. That's why they built the sewage treatment plants next to the river, so they could dump their sewage into the river. It was appalling. And then in the 1990s, Dixie Sampson was able to get a bill passed that stopped the direct discharge of sewage into the Indian River Lagoon. And things started improving. It started getting better. How long do you want me to keep going?
Oh, I'm personally.
Okay. Keep on going. So this is the lagoon from my perspective, right. From a child that grew up on it, that, I was wild and free, could go wherever I wanted to. I had my own boats. I could go anywhere I wanted. And there was seagrass beds as far as you could go. The bottom of the river close to the shore was just a carpet of seagrass, endless, not never ending. It was so beautiful. We caught seahorses in our nets and all kinds of other animals. It was just a magical place. And so it started improving after the passage of that law, and the seagrass, started coming back, and it was growing and growing and growing. And then finally, by 2009, the seagrass coverage in the lagoon had surpassed that of the 1940s, when they first started keeping records of the seagrass growth. So everything was looking really, really good. And then 2010, in the winter of 2010, 2011, we had some really, really serious freezes, a series of very, very cold freezes. And I have my own theory about that. But anyway, the freezes killed millions and millions of fish. And I think that maybe the water quality had already been so bad that the fish were stressed. Because I don't think, had those freezes happened in the 1960s, 1970s, I don't think that many millions of fish would have died. Sure, the freezes back then, well, coal killed some fish, but not like millions of them. Right. So all those fish died, they sank to the bottom and rotted, and they created this huge nutrient surge into the lagoon, which fueled the first of the massive algae blooms that we've been experiencing in the Indian River. So we had blue-green algae in 2011, 2012, took out 47,000 acres of seagrass. And then we've had algae blooms ever since then. One of the worst ones was in 2016. The dissolved oxygen got so low one night in March in 2016 that, again, millions of fish died. The canals in Cocoa Beach were covered with dead fish, and they stank, and it was terrible. And they sank to the bottom and rotted and released more nutrients into the lagoon. And we've had this series of recurring algae blooms, all the way up to 2020. The 2016 dead fish kill was the trigger that enabled the citizens of Brevard County to vote to tax themselves, and create the Save Our Indian River Lagoon program. It's a half-penny sales tax that was originally expected to raise $350 million, but the economy has been good and more people have moved here, and instead of $350 million, it's going to raise more than $500 million, every penny of which has gone into projects to help the lagoon. And I believe that the improvements that we're starting to see in the lagoon now can be attributed to the wisdom of the Brevard County voters in voting to tax themselves to do projects to help the lagoon.
Right on. And then I think that's the year that you and I had met, 2016, when my will was thwarted. I intended, after retiring, getting back to the area in Brevard, I wanted to teach my kids how to fish and, all that jazz. And that was about the same time when the lagoon was starting to cough up blood. So yeah, that was a momentous year. So you mentioned, I'm sorry.
That was a terrible year.
Yes, yes. So you mentioned just now that you are seeing good news signs. Can you tell us about that?
I can. The first thing that, and this is the thing that everybody is seeing, is the water clarity. It, every year it's gotten a little bit better. Now the lagoon cycles, and
Right.
When I was a kid, it didn't get all cloudy in the summertime. It stayed clear all the time. It was always clear. But we've had, in later years, there's so much stormwater and lawn fertilizer and other things, nitrogen and phosphorus, that are going into the lagoon, that summertime became the time of cloudy water. But then in the wintertime, when we get less rainfall, the water would clear up. But those periods of clear water have gotten a little bit longer each year, and this year it's been amazing. We've still had really nice clear water well into July. Of course, we haven't had a lot of rainfall this summer either, and that's helped too. Right. But the water clarity is something that you can't miss it. The other thing that's happening is we're starting to see some seagrass coming back, and it's coming back really strong. It came back strong in Mosquito Lagoon. I started noticing that there was seagrass rhizomes kind of washing up on the beach, on the western shore of Mosquito Lagoon in the summer of 2021. Mm-hmm. And the summer of 22 was a lot better. And this coincided with the graphing that St. Johns River Water Management District, does. They do their transects every year. And so what I was seeing washing up on the shoreline coincided with what they were seeing on their transects. And so, we went from just a 5% increase in growth to 25% increase in coverage. And then last year it exploded, and we had 95% aerial coverage of seagrass in the southern Mosquito Lagoon. It was unbelievable. And what was in 2020, the blooms that we got, starting in 2018, stretching into 2020, they took out all the seagrass in the northern Indian River and the southern Mosquito Lagoon. There wasn't even any grassolaria left. There was no no callirapa, no nothing. The bottom was bare. And so with this increase in grass was so it was so exhilarating to see. But the in 2020 we had the horrible starvation deaths. In 2021, the horrible starvation deaths of manatees, which is it's too painful to even think about. The long, slow, painful death that these animals went through. And what I and their behavior changed. They were dragging themselves up on people's lawns and eating St. Augustine grass. They were pulling the leaves off of the lower limbs of mangroves. They were eating anything green that they could get their mouths on to try to survive. And they stopped mating. They stopped frolicking. Like I do a lot of kayaking, and you can go to Haulover Canal and go into Bears Cove, and there's always lots of manatees, and they're frolicking and playing and pushing the boats around. They stopped all of that playful behavior. They stopped mating. For a couple of years, I did not see manatees mating in the spring. And that first in 2022 was the first year that I noticed that the manatees were starting to mate again. And so a few manatees were mating, and then last year there were lots of manatees mating, and this year there's lots and lots of manatees mating, and I'm seeing baby manatees this year. So what's alarming is that we've lost several years of baby manatees being born. And so it's been wonderful watching the manatees, at least the ones that are hanging out in southern Mosquito Lagoon, getting fat again and going back to the behaviors that I've seen since I was a child and missed so badly, during the 2020 and 2021, probably even 2019. So that's been really exhilarating watching that happen. So the reason that I know, I think it's, I don't think, I know the reason that the grass came back in the southern Mosquito Lagoon. Well, there's multiple reasons. One reason is that the southern Mosquito Lagoon is very, very shallow. So even with the cloudy water that we had in 2021, enough sunlight was able to get to the really, really shallow places in the lagoon so that the seagrass could start coming back. And as the seagrass was coming back, then that helped hold the bottom down. That's one of its functions. And seagrass also is a really good, it pulls a lot of nutrients out of the water. So getting the seagrass started again, besides being able to feed the manatees and have a hiding place for baby fish, was really important for water quality. But the southern Mosquito Lagoon, unlike most other estuaries in Florida, has no development on it at all. Right. The east side is Canaveral National Seashore. The west side is the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge, and it's within the boundaries of the Kennedy Space Center. So there's no stormwater going into Mosquito Lagoon. There's no wastewater treatment plants next to the shoreline overflowing sewage into the Mosquito Lagoon every time we have a summer thunderstorm, the way some of the plants are here now. And there's no homes with septic tanks that have leakage going into the southern Mosquito Lagoon. So I believe, oh, and this is important too, there's the only fresh water that goes into the southern Mosquito Lagoon falls from the sky as rain. So there's literally no extra fresh water going into the Mosquito Lagoon estuary. And a healthy estuary, it is made up of freshwater, natural freshwater sources mixed with seawater that comes in through the inlets. Stormwater is not a natural source of fresh water. And there's too much stormwater going into our lagoons. And we're doing a really good job of retrofitting and putting baffle boxes in where there's outfalls going into the lagoon. And we're doing everything we can to try to reduce nutrients from going into the lagoon. The reduction of nitrogen and phosphorus has to happen if we want any of Florida's estuaries to bounce back to the way that they once were. But freshwater itself, too much freshwater is a pollutant to a healthy estuary. So even with the baffle boxes in place, you still have too much fresh water going into our estuaries. And that's going to make it hard to get clam and oyster populations to come back strong. We've got a lot of restoration going on here in the Indian River Lagoon, and there's a lot of oyster restoration going on further north in Mosquito Lagoon too. And the clam restoration is going strong. But until we can solve the problem of too much fresh water going into the Indian River Lagoon, all of these efforts they're producing things that are surviving, like the seagrass that's coming back, it's surviving. There's oysters that are surviving, clams, but we need to reduce the amount of fresh water going in so that instead of just barely surviving, these animals start thriving again, the way that they did when I was a kid.
Right.
So the Indian River, the Mosquito Lagoon was going great. We had all this seagrass that was growing back, and the manatees are getting fat and happy, and they're starting to have babies again. But there's still nothing going on in the Indian River Lagoon. Well, the Indian River is deeper it's not as shallow as Mosquito Lagoon, and it still has development along it. So all of these efforts, it took a long time for the river to die, and it's going to take a while for it to come back again too. But I've seen there's signs that the seagrass is starting to recover in the very northern end of the Indian River Lagoon. I got Lauren Hall, who is the seagrass biologist for the St. Johns River Water Management District, sent a picture that she took about 3 weeks ago now, and she was way up in the north end of the Indian River Lagoon, not Mosquito Lagoon, but the Indian River Lagoon. And when I saw the picture, I said, "Oh, that's Mosquito Lagoon," and they said, "No, it's the Indian River Lagoon." So it was up by just south. If you know where Scottsmore Landing is, it was just south of Scottsmore Landing at a transect by the Big Flounder Creek. So we went up there in a boat today to look for the seagrass, and I had this picture that Lauren had sent, burned into my brain, but the water clarity was awful. It was terrible. I was planning on taking all kinds of pictures of seagrass, and that didn't happen. The pictures didn't happen, but the seagrass is there. You could see the shadow in the water, and when we got really, really shallow, we could see, haliduli and rupia, and rupia is seeding, the flowers going way out, stretching out into the water. It was just an amazing sight, because that was an area that hasn't had seagrass for 7 years now. It's been 7 years since the seagrass all died up there. And we were able to collect a lot of rhizomes just from picking. There was big wads of grass just laying on top of the water, that had been dislodged by waves or manatees or whatever. And we were able to get a really nice amount of seagrass rhizomes to use for lagoon restoration out of the Indian River today instead of Mosquito Lagoon. Nice. So again, you have the similar situation in the northern Indian River Lagoon as what you have in the southern Mosquito Lagoon. There is development up here, the north of Mims, the town of Scottsmore is there. But the difference is that instead of big, huge subdivisions where the houses are on quarter-acre lots, or now the development pattern is like houses are 10 feet apart. there are no huge subdivisions. There's no trailer parks. The lot sizes are mostly 1 acre or 5 acres, 2.5 acres, even 10 acres. The
Mm.
lot sizes are 10 acres or more. The closer you get to the lagoon, the bigger the lots get. So you don't have, even though everybody up here is on septic, you don't have a lot of septic tanks. And the ones that are here, most of the density is along US 1. It's a long way from the lagoon. And so the Save Our Indian River Lagoon program has done an excellent job of retrofitting the big ditches that are up here with bioactivated media and rocks and all this stuff that's in the bottom of the ditches now that will pull the nutrients out of the water. So there's a lot of reduction of nutrients that is going into the waters up here in the northern Indian River Lagoon. Of course, there's no wastewater treatment plants up here that are overflowing sewage into the lagoon. And, other than the few ditches that we have, the only fresh water coming in up here comes from a natural source. It's called Turnbull Creek. It's actually the beginning of the Indian River Lagoon. And since we haven't had hardly any rain here this summer, actually the water's salty way up in Turnbull Creek because that's one of the places where I water test every week. And usually it'll get a little salty in March, April timeframe when we haven't had a lot of rain. But I had 33 parts per thousand at the US 1 bridge this summer. I couldn't believe how salty the water was, but there's virtually no water coming out of Turnbull Swamp at all. So Turnbull Creek drains a large wetland that stretches from Mims to Edgewater. And it all kind of flows towards the middle, and then it drains out into the Indian River through Turnbull Creek. So we've had a very, very unusual conditions up here. The water's really, really salty, and we haven't had any rain, and the seagrass is loving it.
I would too. That's wonderful. So, as it pertains to what the initiative is about, which is to amend the Florida Constitution with a fundamental and enforceable right to clean and healthy waters. How do you see that helping with the pre-existing efforts and advocacy pushes and things like that that need to happen? How do you see those two things relate to each other?
Well, first of all, my belief is that all Floridians have a right and an expectation to be able to recreate in our water bodies. And that goes for springs and lakes and our estuaries, our nearshore ocean coastal waters.
Mhm.
You ought to be able to eat the fish that you catch when you're fishing in those waters. And you ought to be able to go swimming and have a cut on your foot and then not have to have your foot amputated because you got an infection from swimming in the water in Florida. It could be very bad for tourism,
Yeah.
you know, for if it gets any worse. But
Yeah.
so I think that this amendment, with the specter of a lawsuit against the agencies that are supposed to be regulating the entities that put stuff into our waters is just the thought that they would be held accountable in court is going to help our situation with trying to get Florida's waterways cleaned up.
I see that as very true as well. Historically, it seems like a lot of entities don't do certain things unless and until they can get sued for it. It's a sad reality, but um, with the issues affecting Florida agencies, there's a lot of political influence involved and priority issues and things like that. So when the more resourced interests have the say. The interests of the people, the health and safety and well-being of the people often get superseded. So that's kind of in my opinion, that's why I'm volunteering all my time to to make this happen, because it is a necessary surgical but necessary change that will lend to important systemic change. It's a priority issue. The people are going to be more important than special interests or private profits or anything like that. Health and safety come first under the amendment. So so that being said, you've talked about previous interviews, I think, about the industry's interests. Various industries, the tourism industry, fishing industry. How do you think their interests would be affected with a right to clean water in place?
Well, since they're not an agency that's in charge of, you know, what's going in our water, it's not going to affect them, other than it would be beneficial to clean up Florida's waterways. It would be good for tourism. I mean, I'll take my restaurant for an example.
Mhm.
My parents started Dixie Crossroads in 1983, and their menu consisted of locally caught seafood. They served mullet and sea trout and black drum and oysters and clams that came out of the Indian River. The shrimp, we caught them offshore. We still do, but the shrimp live in the Indian River for the first part of their lives, or Florida's estuaries. They live in all our estuaries, but then they get big enough and they go offshore, and then the big shrimp boats can catch them. But without an estuary, we wouldn't have a shrimping industry. So over the years, as the river went further and further into decline, we had to change our whole menu mix at the restaurant because we couldn't get spotted sea trout anymore. And we can't even get fresh mullet out of the Indian River anymore. Usually when I have mullet, it's coming from the West Coast, from over in Tampa Bay or around Crystal River or somewhere like that, because we still don't have enough mullet in the river, to have a decent mullet fishery. Um, and so we still serve domestic American caught seafood as much as we can, but the going back to what we have started out with, that's just not possible anymore. And so the decline in Florida's estuaries has impacted Florida's commercial fishing industry. It has impacted Florida's multi-gazillion billion-dollar recreational fishing industry.
Right.
It's affecting the ecotourism operators. For a couple of years, the kayak guides here in the Indian River were seeing dead manatees floating around. That's not good for tourism. That's not the impression you want your clients to go back home with, is the image of a bloated dead manatee floating around on your kayak trip.
That is bad for business.
Yes.
No bueno.
And then the guide's saying, don't put your hands in the water. Don't, it's not safe. Don't, if you have a cut on your hand, please don't put it in the water because it's not safe. That's not good for tourism. But then so much of Florida's tourism industry depends on beach tourism too. And when we have these big fish kills, like we had in Southwest Florida, when they had the red tide and they had a whale shark wash up on the beach, and dead sea turtles and dead manatees and millions of pounds of dead fish, washing up on the beach, it killed the summer tourism industry in Southwest Florida, in the Fort Myers, Charlotte Harbor area. And then at the same time, we had a green algae bloom going over, blue-green algae bloom taking place in the southern Indian River Lagoon. And that was because of the discharges that were coming out of Lake Okeechobee. And the green slime that was on top of the water was so horrible that year, it killed the tourism season in Stewart and Fort Pierce area, just wiped out their summer business. So that made an impression on the local operators that had been affected, and
Mhm.
they started getting interested in making sure that things got fixed. But then you had a couple of years where we didn't have any algae blooms, and the memories are short,
Yeah, yeah.
unfortunately. Like,
Goldfish.
tourism is not like the commercial fishing industry and the recreational fishing industry, where in our area, a lot of the guides left this area and they went to Louisiana and Texas where they had clean water and they could keep the fish that they catch. So we've gone from being the redfish capital of the world in northern Indian River and southern Mosquito Lagoon, to the place where you can't even keep a redfish if you catch one. So that was really, we used to have a half a dozen fishing tournaments a year, that were based out of Titusville, and they would fill up our hotels and eat in the restaurants, and it was really, really good. Business was great when there was a fishing tournament. We haven't had a fishing tournament here in more than 10 years. That little bit of business, well, it wasn't a little bit, that was a big piece of business. It's gone.
Yeah.
And if we don't fix the lagoon, it'll never come back. The bait shop operators are suffering, the fishing guides are suffering. And these are all tourism components, but they don't involve a beach. So what gets the hospitality industry's attention is when beach tourism is affected.
Yeah.
But we really need to work to try to get them to understand the commercial fishing industry is still suffering, but we don't need a beach. The
Right.
recreational fishing industry suffers, but again, they don't need a beach. So we really need to work hard to try to make the leaders in the tourism industry understand that if we continue on the path that we're on, then they could be, instead of every once in a while a little small area getting affected, that could spread and make things a whole lot worse than they were in 2016 and 2018 when we had the big algae blooms.
Right. So let's wrap up. I know I've taken a lot of your time. Thank you so much for it. Um, if you were to have 30 full seconds, 30 seconds of the attention of not just these industry leaders, but also fellow advocates for clean water and environmental conservation and things like that, or just the average Florida voter, um, knowing what benefits, long-term benefits, future generational benefits that a constitutional amendment would bring for Florida, what would you say to them to kind of wake them up and persuade them to at least sign and send in their ballot petition, but maybe even support in some way, like to volunteer or donate? What would be your message? 30 seconds or less.
If we want to keep having fresh Florida seafood on our plates, and if we want to keep a strong tourism industry going and not be threatened by periodic algae blooms or fish kills, or you can't go in the water and go swimming, or you might end up with your arm being amputated, then we need this amendment. The methodology that's been in place for years is not enough. It hasn't worked. Things keep getting worse. So the things that the agencies have tried for the last 20 years are not making improvements in our water quality. We need stronger regulation, and we need to get our waters cleaned up, or it's going to impact Florida's economy.
Thank you so very much for your time today, Laurilee, and I wish you the very best, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you, and
With
thanks for
Florida.
all of your hard work. I know I know how hard you're working, raising kids and all the things that you're doing. It's amazing, and
It's all for the big picture, right?
yeah, the people of this state should thank you.
Oh,
And thanks for letting me talk tonight.
oh, I appreciate every single moment. Thank you again. All right, have a good one.